Hello and welcome everyone to this live stream. I have been wanting to create a video to discuss this topic for a while because I think it's very important for IB Economics teachers as well as IB Economics students to understand this skill, how to evaluate in IB Economics. In the video description below, you'll find the link to the blog post that I'm going to be referring to. I have a blog post about this topic in the video description below. You'll also find ways you can support this channel. You can become a channel member, you can buy me a coffee, or you can just like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel. These are simple ways for you to say thanks and to support the channel. So before I begin how to evaluate in IB Economics, let's roll the intro. Okay, so as I mentioned, this live stream will talk about how to evaluate in IB Economics. And this is the blog post that I'm referring to. It is on my blog. The blog post is titled A Beginner's Guide to Evaluation in IB Economics. All right. So first thing I want to say is that evaluation is not rocket science. In fact, the way the syllabus is structured and the way your textbooks, whatever textbook you're using, by the way, the way it's structured, there's already lots of evaluation. The first thing you need to know about evaluation is that it's all about balance. What do I mean by this? Well, in its simplest form, evaluating in IB Economics involves thinking about arguments and balancing them with counter arguments while drawing upon evidence to support those arguments and or counter arguments. Okay, so the first keyword is balance. You want to balance between arguments and counter arguments. You want to make sure whatever you are evaluating, you have some arguments and some counter arguments, and that you are balancing between them. You're not taking one side over another. But the point is, these arguments and counter arguments, you need to draw upon evidence. They need to be supported by evidence. Now, what do I mean by this? So, both standard level and higher level students, where do you evaluate? Okay, so where are you required to evaluate? For both SL and HL students, you will evaluate in paper 1, part B, which is the 15-mark question, and you will also be required to evaluate in paper 2, part G, which is also a 15-mark question. However, what is the difference between paper 1, part B and paper 2, part G? Well, paper 1, part B, you will need to draw upon your own real-world examples. So draw upon your own real-world example. And I have videos about how to construct a bank of real-world examples. While paper 2, part G, you will draw upon, so the evidence, you will draw upon the case study or the texts that are provided. So paper 1, part B, you are drawing upon your own real-world examples. Paper 2, part G, you're drawing upon the case study or the text. But you're still applying the same skill set, which is evaluating, okay? Now, HL students, separately, HL students will also need to evaluate in paper 3, which is only for HL students, part B. That's the policy paper, where you recommend a government policy. This is a 10-mark question. You recommend a government policy. You have to be able to evaluate this policy while drawing upon real-world examples. So this is where you are required to evaluate. So how do you evaluate? That's the first, well, that's the next logical question. Well, here I have written down all of my approaches, the approaches I teach my students. The first approach is think about the pros of whatever you're evaluating versus the cons. What are the advantages of whatever it is you're evaluating? Say, for example, it's a government policy. What are the advantages? Can you think of real-world examples to support these advantages? Now balance them with what are the disadvantages. So what are the pros versus cons of whatever it is you're evaluating? Okay, this is the first approach. Think of things like advantages versus disadvantages. These are all different words for the same thing. Think of, arguments for versus arguments against if you're evaluating trade protection, for example. Okay, well, can you draw upon evidence from real world examples, either your own for paper one, part B, or the case study, the article for paper two, part G? Okay, that's the first approach. The second approach, think about the short run versus the long run. If you're evaluating something that has consequences, are those consequences different in the short run than they are in the long run? So, say you're evaluating a tax on cigarettes. Cigarettes are a demerit good. In the short run, that might not really discourage smoking that much because smoking tends to be addictive and smokers tend to have inelastic demand. But in the long run, the fact that cigarettes are more expensive, that might put off some people from picking up smoking. In the long run, it will be more effective. So think about the short run versus the long run. Here, you can talk about the consequences of whatever it is you're evaluating. What are the consequences in the short run or the effects versus in the long run? The third approach is stakeholder analysis, basically. Stakeholder analysis, okay, think about who are the winners, sorry, not whiners, winners versus who are the losers. Who are the stakeholders that gain from this decision or this change or whatever it is you're evaluating? Well, who are the stakeholders that lose? Okay, so stakeholder analysis. So far I've given you three approaches to evaluation: pros versus cons, short run versus long run, winners versus losers. And this last one is actually my favorite. Okay, think about how things work in theory. What does the theory say versus how they work in practice? Very often, things in practice do not fit the theory, right? Things in practice very often unfold differently from what the theory predicts, often because the theory is based on unrealistic assumptions like ceteris paribus, right? In the real world, nothing is held constant, right? The economy is constantly and markets are constantly dynamic and changing. So think about how things are unfolding in theory versus, sorry, how things are expected to unfold in theory versus how they're actually unfolding in practice. Okay, so think about these things. This is where you think of the limitations of the theory or the economic models that you are using in your analysis and your evaluation. Okay, so these are three approaches to evaluation: pros versus cons, short run versus long run, winners versus losers, how things work in theory versus how they work in practice. Now, which ones do you choose? Well, that will depend on whatever it is you're evaluating. Okay, it's contextualized in whatever it is you're evaluating. For example, if you're evaluating a government policy, you might think about the pros versus the cons, the short run versus the long run, who gains versus who loses. If you're evaluating something that doesn't necessarily, where something in real life isn't necessarily matching how the theory predicts, then you might want to talk about in theory versus in practice, stakeholder analysis, and short run versus long run. Again, you will pick whichever of these, pick three out of these four evaluation frameworks, okay? And use them to construct your evaluation while integrating the real world example or the case study in the case of paper two, part G. Now, here in the blog post, I also say the word however. I love that word. However, this word is your best friend, okay? So when you provide an argument for or an advantage, and you incorporate a real world example or examples or evidence from the case study, however, you balance it with a counter argument, okay, or an argument against or whatever. Remember when I said it's all about balance? You are required to show balance in your evaluation, that you are aware you can discuss the arguments and balance them with the counter arguments. It's not a debate where you have to take sides, it's a discussion. It's an evaluation where you have to weigh the strengths and the weaknesses. Okay? Now, again, don't forget to reach a conclusion. So if you'll notice here, I say, Once you have evaluated by discussing arguments and counter arguments while drawing upon evidence, remember to reach a conclusion. I usually advise my students to use the words on balance to signal that they're about to conclude their evaluation. You do not need to use all these evaluation strategies I mentioned, by the way, to secure the highest marks on your essay. Just pick the three that are most relevant to the context of the real world examples or the texts that you are using. Okay, so where else are you going to be required to evaluate? So I said in paper 1 part B, in paper 2 part G, and paper 3 part B, you will also be required to evaluate in your IA, in your internal assessment. In fact, there's a whole criterion E, which is out of 3 marks, is all about evaluation. So you are required to evaluate in pretty much every paper you will take and every assessment you will do. So it's a skill that is very important for you to master. Think about pros versus cons, advantages versus disadvantages, arguments for versus arguments against, short run effects or consequences versus long run consequences, stakeholder analysis. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? Who gains versus who loses? Think about how things work in theory. What are the limitations of the theory versus how they're actually unfolding in practice? And then pick the ones that are most relevant to your real world example. And I have a video about how to collect a bank of real world examples. Or in the case of paper 2 or in your internal assessment, the evaluation talking points or frameworks that are most relevant to the text or the article that you are evaluating. I hope you found this useful. I've been wanting to create this video for a while. Sometimes I like to take a break from explaining content and focusing more on skills, focusing more on approaches to learning IB economics and getting a high mark. Again, once again, I remind you, the link to the blog post that I'm referring to here is in the video description below. You can also find several ways to support the channel, like becoming a member or buying me a coffee. Please like, share, subscribe. These are simple things that you can do if you have enjoyed this video and you have found it useful. Have a great rest of your weekend, and I look forward to making more videos to help you on your journey through IB Economics, whether as a teacher or as a student. Have a good one.